In about 11 months, there will be a new law passed where everybody needs to have something called a real ID. It starts October 1st, 2020, and what it is a driver's license or identification card that allows you to travel within the United States. Right now, your current driver's license, if it's not a real ID, if after October 1st, 2020, it would not be the correct ID. So you have to sort of upgrade your ID. There are all sorts of things attached to what this means. There's some philosophical issues. There's some alarmist, issues. People are thinking that, this is the transition even deeper into fascism. And yes, I am one of those people that believes that. When you start asking for people's identification before they can get on a plane to travel from like Indiana to Kentucky, that's a problem. Right now, the driver's license should suffice, but it doesn't after October 1st, 2020. So if you have a passport, you're fine. And as long as you don't let your passport expire, then you're fine. You basically have to have your passport everywhere you go after October 1st, 2020, or you have to have something called a real ID. I have a passport, so I can travel outside of the United States and I can travel within the United States after October 1st, 2020. I can travel outside of the United States right now with my passport. I can travel within the continental United States with my current driver's license right now. But after October 1st, 2020, in about 11 months, I will not be able to travel within the continental United States with just my current driver's license. I'll have to use my passport or a real ID. The real ID is also attached to things like if you are in debt, if you're behind on your tax payments, if you are behind on your card payments, if you're behind on your mortgage. And this could alter your freedom of movement. Lack of freedom of movement and lack of autonomy over your own body and your own, sense of movement is fascistic. It's fascism. Um, so I think that it is a very chilling thing that's coming around the corner. It's been on the books since 2005, but it's had enough pushback all these years. So for 14 years, people have been pushing back. But now less and less people are pushing back, and more states are forcing their citizens to get a real ID. So it's happening. It's very scary. It's part of the transition into fascism that has been implemented ever since 9/11. That's why we had 9/11, so that we could have these really oppressive, draconian laws put in place, which destroy our autonomy and take away our freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of movement. These are basic human rights. These are basic, ways that a society exists in the best way that it possibly can. It's not utopian by any means, but it at least gives you the freedom to explore ideas, to have open discourse. And when your freedom of speech and your freedom of movement is taken away, then you cannot. And that means that you're sort of in a master-slave relationship with your government, and that's really dangerous. And this is what was introduced. This sort of concept of the real ID was introduced in the beginning stages of fascism in Nazi Germany. So we want to pay attention to things like that. And don't you find it ironic that mainstream media isn't talking about this like on a 24-hour news cycle? They should be telling everybody everywhere you need to have your real ID if you plan on traveling within the continental United States in the next 11 months. And you should probably start the process right now, so that if you have travel plans after October 1st of 2020, that you will be set, that you'll be okay, you can travel. So it's really frustrating for me. I'm not CNN. I'm not MSNBC. I don't get paid to to shill out commentary that is emotionally driven, or it will manipulate you psychologically. I am just telling you about the rules that are in place. Another uh, situation that I wanted to speak about was a meme that's going around on social media, which is it's really depressing to me to see this kind of meme go around. It looks like it was created by the Democratic Socialists of America, and there's a picture of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez speaking about how being, a wage slave earner, like, that's really American, and nobody should make you feel shame for being like a hamburger flipper or a bus driver or anything like that. And so what this is a very simplified, extremely infantile shaming meme. It doesn't have any context whatsoever, which means memes often don't. Um, it's probably why I've never been very good at memes, because I tend to look at least two or three layers below the actual context of the message itself, because I know that there are layers of subtext to things. So when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez comes out and says there's no shame in working a minimum wage job, but she doesn't say minimum wage in the meme, what it says is there's nothing wrong with driving the buses or preparing the food or folding the clothes. So, these are all, but you can understand that these are all minimum wage jobs. And as we know, I mean, everybody should know by now that minimum wage jobs do not sustain a living. That means if you work a minimum wage job, you're living below the poverty line, and you're in a constant state of financial hardship, and you're probably in debt, and you can never get your head above it, because your job doesn't pay you enough. And as a side note, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was not a bartender. She grew up in a very posh suburb of in upstate New York. When she was very young, her father moved her to one of the most prominent zip codes in the United States and enrolled her in one of the most prestigious schools for primary school, grade school. She graduated from high school probably with honors, because she had all of the opportunity to get those grades. And so I often talk about being born into a meritocracy, or being born into opportunity, where your parents paved the way for you. So her father was an architect, made a lot of money. She was never a bartender. That was a marketing campaign. That was a PR campaign. They hired a really great PR firm and marketing agency that makes videos and stuff, kind of like what JP and I do. They hired a really good one to tell a story that would resonate with the working class. That story is completely fabricated. It's not true. She is on the school to president pipeline. And this person who has never bartended, who has never made minimum wage, who has never really had to suffer financially the way the majority of Americans have in this country. The majority of Americans, 50-60% of Americans, cannot afford a $500 emergency. That means if you have a dental emergency, you're sunk. Or if your kid breaks his leg while he's skateboarding, you're sunk. The majority of Americans do not have the kind of meritocracy and privilege and money that she has always had access to. So for her to stand out there in front and be the face of this meme that says there's nothing wrong with working retail or driving buses or preparing food, that is basically her saying that there is no shame in being a slave or a wage slave, but it doesn't talk about the subtext of the pay that's attached to these particular jobs. If we had paid attention to inflation and the markets and the worker, the value of the worker in this country, which has created vast amounts of wealth for a very few people. If we'd have paid attention to that for the last 30 years, we'd be looking at a $22 an hour federal minimum wage. But $7.25 is based on like a 19th century or even early 20th century inflation model, and it's based on that there were fewer workers. Look at all that we've done in the last 30 years. We've got the creation of Silicon Valley. We've got, technology that has surpassed even our wildest dreams. We've got, all of the stuff that we've created, and yet our wage system is still back in like the 1970s or the 1980s before any of this really hit the market. So there's definitely something wrong with this statement that says there's nothing wrong with being a working person in the United States of America. Well, that's true. There is nothing wrong with that. But there is something wrong with how we are underpaid in this country. You should not be making $7.25 an hour. That's why I always advocate for your worker-owned means of production. That's why I advocate for things like get a Patreon account and start getting creative. Patreon is an interesting, we have a Patreon page, and it's an interesting concept that a lot of people don't understand. There are people who will literally read the newspaper on their Patreon pages and make thousands of dollars a month because there are other people that don't want to read. They want to have somebody else read to them. So there are people that read the newspaper, just like the New York Times or Huffington Post, all of the mainstream newspapers out there. They'll just read the articles and maybe they'll have a little comment here and there, but they literally make thousands of dollars doing this. There are other people that are a little more creative. They create, movies that talk about important subject matters, and they also make money on Patreon. So this is what's considered like a worker-owned means of production. You create your own means of production. You are literally your own boss. You're your own worker, and you create it. There's also a concept of when it comes to worker-owned means of production, whereas, if everybody galvanized inside of, say, one McDonald's and said, let's all get together and discuss creating our own means of production and putting a price on what we produce and then sticking to that price and saying, I'm actually worth $18 an hour, not $7 an hour, then we could have a better system in play that would make it so that it's okay to work these jobs that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is saying there's nothing wrong with having these jobs, and there's not. But what is wrong is that they're not paying enough. And they're also devaluing human beings. If you had your own means of production, then you would have a better sense of what you are worth. And the state and the system and the corporations that hire you would have a better sense of what you're worth. But our wage slave system is based on at-will employment, which basically says, it's an Orwellian term that basically says the company that hires you has the right to fire you for whatever reason they want. And they don't even have to have a reason. And they can even lie and say something about you that isn't true, and that they have the legal right to fire you. But in turn, if you're working a job and you're unhappy, you also have the right to quit. Back when, there was slavery, there was no at-will employment, meaning that the slaves were not paid by the masters, and the slaves could not quit. They couldn't just walk out of the plantation one day and say, you know what, that's it. I don't like this plantation. I heard really good things about that one over there. I'm going to go over there and work with those guys. they couldn't do that. They were owned by their masters. They were owned by their employers. So when the federal, system was in place for our when we started actually paying people to work instead of having child labor or slaves, they created something called at will, which meant that you could leave whenever you wanted. Like, you weren't stuck working at this place if you were unhappy there. So, and that's really it. Like, there's really no protection for the employee. But what it does is, adversely, it tells the employee that they're stuck at these jobs that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has never worked a day in her life. And she's telling you that there's nothing wrong, that you can work these, slave wage jobs. So it keeps you in that state of fear, where if you ask for more money, then your employer could turn around and fire you. And they could say, well, we're going to fire you. And you could say, is it because I asked for more money? And they would say, oh, well, we can't really say, because it's at will. We can fire you for whatever reason we want, and we don't even have to tell you what those reasons are. So a lot of people don't stir the pot. They don't ask for more money. They don't ask for better protection. They don't ask for time off. They don't ask for anything, because they're so afraid their employer will retaliate and then they'll be out of a job. So that's one of the reasons why the minimum wage has stagnated at $7.25, is because we have a fear-based labor system in place. And so when you've got Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez saying, don't let anybody shame you for working these jobs, what she's really saying is, be okay with working these jobs exactly as they are right now. Don't galvanize with the employees. Don't collect, your employees together and go and to the powers that be and say, as a collective, as a unit, we are demanding better wages. Don't do any of that. It's okay to be a working person in the United States of America. It's the same thing when George W. Bush said, in response to a woman who had to work 3 jobs because she couldn't retire yet, he said, wow, that's uniquely American. And so it's the same thing. She's doing the same thing. This is just Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in kind of a different way, saying that she's just like George Bush. I see no difference between her and George Bush, actually. So I'm going to go back to my original subject, which was about the Real ID. We did a video called Restriction of Movement. It was really good. It was really artistically done, and I would suggest that you watch it. I'll put it in the description of this audio so that you can take a look at it. But these are the 2 things that I'm noticing are transitioning into fascism. And it's it's this idea that you should be happy to be a wage slave, and you should keep yourself from understanding what it means to have your own means of production. And you should also not pay attention to facts and figures that people have reported on over the years, saying that based on this 21st century economy where we are right now, we should be at $22 an hour in our minimum wage. And the whole system in place wants to keep you from knowing about any of this, because that's fascism, is to keep people uninformed. And also, to also keep you, and to going back to the Real ID, to restrict your movement is really interesting, because to me, these 2 subject matters kind of go hand in hand, because in other countries, God forbid you go to another country, or maybe you even go to like San Francisco, where the minimum wage is $15 an hour, and community college is free, and there's something called universal health care, or the San Francisco Health Care Act, which is basically like Medicare for all in San Francisco specifically. And they had recently passed something where it's like if you went on a vacation, And even though you've already maybe even had used up your company vacation days, that the city is forcing the company to continue to pay for your vacation days. So because there's so much money that pours into that city, that they know that the labor force there and the labor field there is very strong and could really fight back. So they put in all these protective measures to make sure that people are living in a having a livable wage and living the kind of life that everybody deserves to live. I don't care if you work at McDonald's. You deserve to make $22 an hour. You deserve to have your vacations paid for. You deserve to have your medical benefits. And you deserve to have at least some classes that your company will pay for to put you on a path of success. And these are some of the things that are in other countries. And so by diminishing your capacity to travel and visit these other places, by restricting your movement, will keep you from being informed. In Germany and Sweden and Spain and I don't know, many other countries out there, some Latin American countries, and definitely some Northern European countries that are democratic socialist type countries. They have minimum wage of like $18 an hour. If you're a McDonald's worker, you have medical benefits. You get free college, free child care if you have children and have to work. Fathers get paternity leave or maternity leave. Mothers get it as well for like a year, because those states and those government bodies and parliamentarian systems put a lot of weight into the bonding time between the child and the mother. None of this business of like forcing you to go back to work when the kid's only 12 weeks old. So like we have in this country. So restricting your movement and passing the real ID keeps you from being informed about all of the protections and all of the benefits that people outside of these borders have. So I thought that I would share that information with you and say that these two, they don't seem to be related. The thing with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez wanting you to be happy with staying in an oppressive wage that does not sustain a living, it does not help you survive. Basically telling you that as an American you should be proud to have that. That is connected to the Real ID Act, which will keep your movement from being restricted. So you can't even go outside of your own state. You can't even travel outside of the state of Pennsylvania without this specific ID. Makes it difficult to really be informed about what you should have. And Pennsylvania is a pretty oppressive state. Pittsburgh is pretty oppressive. There's not a lot of freedom here in general. And so it's concerning to me where this is headed, because it's already so restrictive and it's already so dystopic here. It's going to get even worse. So it's concerning to me, which is why I felt compelled to actually do this audio. So I will put in the link to the restriction of movement video that we did some months ago. I'll put it in the description of this audio, and I'll check in with you all in a few days. Thanks.